Ellen Covington's hands did not shake as she leveled the Winchester at the man staggering out of the smoke-hazed tree line, though everything inside her chest was breaking apart at once. "Stop right there, Roscoe Vaughn," she called out, and her voice carried farther than she expected across the frost-rimed yard, cutting through the orange glow still lighting the sky beyond the ridge where the Halloran barn had burned an hour before. "Don't you take one more step." He stopped. He was swaying on his feet, one hand pressed hard against his left shoulder, blood dark and shining between his fingers in the lantern light spilling from the ranch house door. His horse stood behind him, lathered white at the neck, sides heaving like a bellows, and for a moment Ellen almost lowered the rifle out of simple animal pity. Then she remembered what Otis Pruitt had told her not 20 minutes earlier, breathless on his own blown horse, that he had seen Roscoe riding with Jed Talbot's men when they put the torch to Lars Halloran's barn, and that her father had taken a bullet trying to stop them. "I know what Pruitt told you," Roscoe said. His voice was rough but steady, the way it always was, even now with his shirt soaked through and his face gray under the October moon. "It isn't true, Ellen, not one word of it. He said he saw you. He saw me riding hard away from that fire because I just put myself between your father and 4 men with rifles, and I took a piece of lead doing it. If Pruitt was close enough to see my face, he was close enough to see that too." Roscoe's jaw tightened, and for the first time she saw something other than calm in him, something like hurt. "You believe I'd do that to your father, to Lars and Astrid, to you?" Ellen's finger did not leave the trigger guard, but the barrel dipped an inch, then another. Behind her, through the open door, she could hear her father's ragged breathing where she had laid him on the parlor settee not 15 minutes before, a wad of toweling pressed to his side, waiting for a doctor who was a 2-hour ride away in Mount Vernon. She had left him only because she'd heard hoofbeats and thought, God help her, that the men who shot him had come back to finish it. "Then whose bullet is in your shoulder?" she said. "If not one of Talbot's." "One of Talbot's, all right. Fired at my back while I was hauling your father up onto my saddle." He took a slow breath, wincing. "You want to look at the wound, Ellen. You'll see it came in high and from behind. No man shoots his own partner in the back running the same direction he is. And you can ride out to the Halloran place come morning and count the tracks yourself. 6 horses came in from the Cedar Pass Road. 2 of us rode out toward you. If I'd been riding with them, there'd be 5 tracks leaving, not 1. It was the kind of thing only an honest man would think to say, or a very clever liar, and Ellen had spent 3 years watching Roscoe Vaughn work her father's cattle and keep her father's books, and she did not think, whatever else was true, that he was clever in that particular cold-blooded way. She lowered the rifle the rest of the way. "Get inside," she said. "You're bleeding on my mother's yard, and my father needs looking after, and so, evidently, do you." He almost smiled, even hurting as he was. "Yes, ma'am." That was the whole of it, the moment the story afterward would be told and retold about in Alderwood Crossing, though nobody but the 2 of them ever knew how close Ellen Covington had come, in the space of a single indrawn breath, to putting a bullet in the only man who had ridden 2 miles through gunfire to save her father's life. The rain that had threatened all evening finally came a little after midnight, drumming soft and steady on the cedar shake roof while Ellen worked by lamplight, first on her father's wound, and then, once Thomas Covington had been settled with enough laudanum to sleep through what remained of the night, on Roscoe's shoulder. She had learned wound tending the way most ranch daughters in that country learned it, from a mother who had crossed an ocean from Aberdeenshire and then a continent by wagon and rail, and who had believed that a woman who could not stop bleeding, set a bone, or birth a calf had no business claiming a homestead. Margaret Covington had been 3 years in her grave now, taken by a fever the second hard winter after they moved north from the Willamette country, and Ellen still measured herself some days against the ghost of her mother's steady hands. "You're going to have a fine scar," she said, probing the wound with more gentleness than her clipped tone suggested. The bullet had passed clean through the meat of his shoulder without touching bone, which was more luck than either of them deserved given the day. Something to impress the girls at the Grange dance, if you can stand to sit still long enough for me to finish. I've never had much use for the Grange dance, Roscoe said. He was sitting backward on a kitchen chair, shirt discarded, and Ellen was doing her level best not to notice the breadth of his shoulders in the lamplight, nor the long, clean lines of muscle earned by 3 years of ranch work before that, and heaven knew how many years of harder work before he'd ever come to Alderwood Crossing. Never had the standing for it anyway. A hired man doesn't get much say in who he dances with. That's a poor excuse, Mr. Vaughn. It's the only one I've got. He hissed as she drew the needle through, then went quiet, and when he spoke again his voice had lost its teasing edge. Ellen, I need you to believe I didn't have any part in what happened tonight. Not because I'm scared of what your father will do if he thinks otherwise, though I expect that'll be considerable, because I couldn't bear it if you thought it of me. She kept her eyes on her work, on the thread and the lamplight and the puckered edges of torn flesh, because it was easier than looking at him. I already told you I believed you. You lowered a rifle. That's not the same as believing. She tied off the last stitch and reached for a clean strip of linen before she let herself meet his eyes. All right then, I believe you, Roscoe. I've known you 3 years. I've watched you gentle a green colt that would have broken another man's arm, and sit up 2 nights running with a sick heifer that wasn't worth the feed she'd eaten, and I have never once known you to tell me anything but the plain truth, even when a lie would have served you better. Otis Prout rode in here with a story that fit together a little too neatly, and I was frightened out of my senses with my father bleeding on the settee, and I am sorry I pointed a rifle at you. There. Is that believing enough? Something eased in his face, and for a moment the kitchen was very quiet except for the rain and the low crack of the stove settling. That's enough, he said softly. That's more than enough. Morning came up gray and cold, the kind of sudden hard frost that could turn a warm October afternoon into a knife-edged night, the way the weather did in that country in the uncertain weeks before winter settled in for good. Ellen rode out with Roscoe at first light, leaving her father under the care of Consuela, the Covingtons' longtime housekeeper, and they picked their way along the muddy track toward the Halloran place with their breaths smoking in the cold. What they found there confirmed everything Roscoe had said and worse. The barn was a blackened skeleton, still smoking faintly at its heart. Lars Halloran stood in his yard with his wife Astrid beside him, both of them gray-faced with shock. Their 2 milk cows saved only because a boy of 12 had had the presence of mind to drive them out through a side gate before the fire took hold. Lars was a broad, quiet man who had come from Norway by way of Minnesota a dozen years before, and Ellen had never seen him look so old as he did standing in the wreckage of what his family had built. They said we had one more chance to sell, Astrid told them, her English still carrying the shape of her mother tongue after all these years, her hands twisting in her apron. 6 years we work this ground. 6 years of stumps and stones and Lars's back breaking to clear it, and they say sell to the combine or the next fire. They will not be so careful where it starts. Careful, Lars said bitterly, kicking at a scorched timber. They call this careful. Roscoe crouched near the barn's foundation and came up holding a spent cartridge casing, turning it in his fingers before handing it to Ellen. 44-40. Talbot's men favor that caliber. Near all of them carry Winchesters chambered for it, same as your father's rifle. He walked a slow circle, reading the churned mud the way another man might read a newspaper, and stopped near the gate. 6 horses, like I told you. All shod the same, fresh shoes, no more than a week old. There's a farrier in Alderwood Crossing does work for the Combine's Remuda exclusive. I've seen that same shoe pattern on horses tied up outside Merrick's office. You think Silas Merrick sent them, Ellen said, though it was less a question than a thing she had already begun to suspect and did not want confirmed. I think Silas Merrick doesn't dirty his own hands with fire and rifles. I think he pays Jed Talbot to control every road and ferry crossing between here and the Seattle stockyards, and calls it protection money when honest ranchers pay it. and calls it necessary discipline when folks like the Hallorans refuse. Roscoe's face had gone hard in a way Ellen had not seen before, and I think if I show you something back at the ranch, you're going to understand why. What he showed her that evening, once her father was resting easier and the two of them sat at the kitchen table with a coal oil lamp burning low between them, was a ledger. Not the ranch's own accounts, which Ellen herself had kept faithfully since her mother's death, because her father had lost his taste for figures along with so much else that hard winter took from him, but a second book, smaller, written in Roscoe's own careful hand, page after page of dates and weights and prices going back nearly a year. Every time I've driven cattle down to the Seattle yards for your father, or for the Hallorans, or for the Petersons and the rest of the small outfits along Cedar Pass Road, I've weighed the stock myself before we ever get near the combine scales, he said. Wrote down every number. And every time, Merrick's scales come in 8, sometimes 10% light against what I know those animals weighed when we started out. Comes to real money over a year, spread across every rancher who has no choice but to sell through him because his gang controls the only safe road to market. Why haven't you told my father? I did tell him, back in the spring. He said Merrick was too big a man in this county to accuse without proof solid enough to hang him, and that if I went around saying such things and turned out wrong, I'd lose my position and maybe worse. He wasn't wrong to be cautious, but I kept the book anyway because somebody in this valley needed to. Roscoe turned a page, showing her a column of figures. I've written to the state cattle inspector's office in Olympia, man named Whitfield. Told him I had evidence of short weighing and asked would the territory, well, the state now I suppose, be interested in looking into it. Haven't heard back yet. Letters take time getting up here, especially with the roads the way they are. Ellen studied the neat, patient handwriting, 3 years of a hired man's quiet defiance laid out in columns, and felt something shift and resettle inside her chest, the way ground shifts after a long rain. You could have been killed for this, she said, if Merrick knew. I expect that's part of why they burned the Hallorans' barn instead of putting a bullet in me outright. Talbot's men aren't fools. A dead cattle buyer with a grudge draws questions. A burned barn on a stubborn Norwegian's land just looks like bad luck, or a careless lantern, unless somebody goes looking hard enough to see the shoe prints. He closed the book and looked at her, and there was something naked in his face that he usually kept carefully hidden. I never meant for you to be caught up in any of it, Ellen. That's the truth. I've kept my head down and done my work and said nothing to you about any of this because it wasn't my place, and because I didn't want to put you in danger just for knowing it. It isn't your place to protect me from the truth about my own home, Ellen said, more sharply than she intended and then gentler. But I understand why you did it. Thank you for telling me now. He held her gaze a moment longer than was strictly comfortable, and something passed between them that neither one of them named. And then the parlor clock chimed the hour and the moment broke, and Ellen rose to check on her father, and the subject for that night was closed. It could not stay closed for long, because 3 days later Everett Merrick rode out to the Covington ranch for Sunday dinner, exactly as he had every second Sunday for the 4 months since Thomas Covington and Silas Merrick had shaken hands on an arrangement that would see Ellen married into the Combine family, and the Covington ranch's considerable debt to the Merrick-controlled bank in Mount Vernon quietly forgiven as part of the bargain. Everett was not, Ellen had told herself many times, an unkind man. He was soft where his father was hard, uncertain where Silas Merrick was ruthless, a young man of 26 who had spent his life in his father's shadow and seemed, most days, faintly surprised to find himself there. He brought her a small bouquet of hothouse flowers that Sunday, shipped up from Seattle at some expense, and sat across the dinner table making careful conversation about the coming statehood celebrations, while Thomas Covington, still pale and moving stiffly from his wound, nodded along and did not ask the questions Ellen could see forming behind his eyes. They're saying the whole territory will celebrate once the proclamation's signed, Everett said. President Harrison's expected to declare Washington a state before winter's out, maybe as soon as next month. My father means to hold a grand market day in town to market, bring in buyers from Seattle and Tacoma both. Says it'll be good for business all around. He glanced at Ellen, a little anxiously, the way he often did, as though checking whether he had said the wrong thing. He's spoken of moving our wedding to coincide with it. Thought it might please you, having the whole county there to celebrate. Ellen kept her face carefully still. How generous of him to think of my preferences. If Everett heard the dryness in that, he gave no sign. Thomas Covington, however, looked up sharply, and later, after Everett had ridden back toward town in the fading light, he caught Ellen alone in the kitchen. "You've grown cold toward that boy," he said. It was not quite an accusation, not from a father who loved her, but there was worry in it, and something else Ellen recognized as shame, though he would never have named it so. "Ellen, I know this isn't the match your mother would have dreamed for you. I know it. But that note comes due in the spring, and without Merrick's forbearance we lose this land, all of it, everything your mother and I built out of nothing. I can't offer you a romance out of a story paper. I can only offer you a way to keep your home. I know, Papa." She did know it, and some nights the knowing sat on her chest like a stone. "I haven't said I won't marry him. But you haven't said you will, not with any joy in it, not since you agreed back in the spring." Thomas rubbed a hand over his face, looking suddenly very tired. "I've made mistakes with this ranch. Bad years, worse decisions, and I won't pretend the debt is anyone's doing but my own poor management. If there were another way—" "There may be another way," Ellen said, before she quite decided to say it. "Papa, has it ever struck you as strange that every buyer who came around 3 years ago, offering a fair price for our cattle, simply stopped coming, right around the time Silas Merrick's combine set up its scales in town? Has it struck you as strange that Talbot's gang seems to know exactly which ranches along Cedar Pass Road are behind on their notes to the Mount Vernon bank, the same bank Merrick sits on the board of?" Her father's face went very still. "What are you saying, girl?" "I'm saying I don't think our troubles are bad luck, Papa. I think they were made, deliberately, by the very man you mean to marry me into." She saw the words land, saw something crumple behind her father's eyes, the particular grief of a proud man realizing he has been played for a fool. "Roscoe has proof, weights, dates, everything written down for the better part of a year. He wrote to the state cattle inspector's office. We're only waiting to hear back." "Roscoe," Thomas repeated slowly, and something in the way he said the name made Ellen's face warm despite herself. "The two of you have been keeping this from me. I've known it 3 days. He's been carrying it alone a good deal longer than that, out of loyalty to you, because he was afraid of exactly what's happening now, that you'd think him overreaching, or that you'd be forced to choose between believing a hired hand and honoring a bargain with a powerful man." She reached out and took her father's roughened hand in both of hers. "I think it's time you heard him out properly, Papa. All of it." That night in the parlor, with the lamps burning late, Roscoe laid the whole ledger before Thomas Covington and walked him through it page by page, patient as he had always been patient with green colts and sick cattle and every other stubborn, wounded thing that had come under his care in this life. Thomas listened without interrupting, his jaw working, and when Roscoe finished he sat a long while in silence. "I owe you an apology," he said finally. "I told you back in the spring I couldn't act on your suspicions without proof, and you went and got the proof anyway, on your own time, at your own risk, and never once threw it back in my face that I doubted you." He extended his hand and Roscoe took it. "You're a better man than I've given you credit for being, Vaughn, a far better one. I only did what seemed right, sir. Most men wouldn't have troubled themselves." Thomas glanced toward Ellen, something calculating and fond moving behind his tired eyes, though he said nothing more of it that night. The letter from Olympia came 11 days later, carried up from the Alderwood Crossing post office by a boy on a borrowed pony, and it was not the swift, decisive answer any of them had hoped for. State Cattle Inspector Whitfield wrote that he had received Mr. Vaughn's correspondence with interest, that short weighing complaints against combined operations were, regrettably, not uncommon across the new state, and that he would be glad to investigate further given sufficient documented evidence and, ideally, corroborating testimony from more than one source, but that his office was small, his territory vast, and his ability to intervene directly in local law enforcement matters limited without the cooperation of county authorities. He noted, with what read like careful understatement, that he was aware Alderwood Crossing's marshal, one Otis Higgins, had previously discouraged similar complaints from reaching his desk, and suggested that any evidence be kept secure and duplicated, given the circumstances. "Meaning he believes us," Roscoe said, reading it over Ellen's shoulder at the kitchen table, "and meaning he can't do a blessed thing about it unless we can get past Higgins, who's bought and paid for same as Talbot's gang." "Meaning we need more than a ledger," Ellen said. "We need something that can't be argued away. Someone besides you willing to say what they've seen." "The Hallorans would speak, I think, now that their barn's already burned. They've little left to lose by it." Roscoe folded the letter carefully. "But it won't be enough on its own. Merrick's got the marshal in his pocket and half the county council besides. We'll need this laid out where enough honest folk can see it plain, all at once before Merrick or Higgins can smother it quiet the way they've smothered every complaint before." "The market day," Ellen said slowly. "The one Everett spoke of. Buyers coming up from Seattle and Tacoma, a newspaper man likely enough given it's meant to celebrate statehood. If the state inspector himself could be persuaded to attend." "Now that," Roscoe said, and for the first time in days something like hope moved across his face, "that might just be worth trying." The weeks that followed were, in their way, the sweetest and most dangerous of Ellen's life, though she would not have named them so at the time, being too occupied with the daily business of survival to notice love creeping in around the edges of it. She and Roscoe rode out together nearly every day, ostensibly on ranch business, gathering testimony from the small outfits scattered along Cedar Pass Road, the Petersons and the Delacroix family and old widow Ruiz, who ran 40 head of cattle on her late husband's claim, all of them willing, once approached, to admit privately what they had never dared say publicly. That Merrick's scales ran light, that Talbot's men had made veiled threats, that the only road to market ran straight through territory the gang considered its own. It was on one such ride, returning at dusk from the Delacroix place with rain coming on fast out of the west, that Ellen's mare stumbled crossing a swollen creek and threw her hard against a half-submerged log, and it was Roscoe who came off his own horse without a moment's hesitation, wading into the cold water in his boots to pull her clear before the current could carry her further. Holding her against his chest on the muddy bank while she coughed water and swore at herself for a fool rider who ought to have known better than to cross in the dark. "I've forded that creek 100 times," she gasped, when she could speak again. "Not with the rain we've had this week swelling it 3 feet over its banks." His arms were still around her, and neither of them seemed in any great hurry to remedy that. His hand had found its way to her hair, pushing wet strands back from her face with a gentleness that made her chest ache in a way the cold water hadn't. "You gave me a fright, Ellen Covington." "Did I?" she said, and something in her voice came out softer than she meant it to. "You did." He looked down at her, rain running off his hat brim, and for a long moment neither of them moved, and Ellen thought with a clarity that startled her that she wanted very badly for him to kiss her, and that she would not have stopped him if he had. But he only helped her to her feet instead, steady and careful, and caught her horse's trailing rein and said, in a voice gone rough at the edges, "We'd best get you home before you catch your death, and before your father wonders what's kept us." "Roscoe." She caught his sleeve before he could turn away, and he went still. "Thank you for pulling me out, for all of it these past weeks. You don't need to thank me for that." He met her eyes, and something raw moved behind his own, something he seemed to be holding back with real effort. "I'd pull you out of any creek in the territory, Ellen, and never think twice, and never expect a word of thanks for it neither." "Why not?" Because that's what a man does for he stopped himself and looked away, out at the darkening water. Because it's the right thing to do, nothing more complicated than that. But it was more complicated than that, and they both knew it, and neither one said so, because Ellen was engaged to marry Everett Merrick in 4 weeks' time, and Roscoe Vaughn was a hired hand with no name and no land and no right. By any reckoning, either of them had been raised to respect, to speak what was plainly growing in his heart. So they rode the rest of the way home in a silence that said more than words might have, and if Ellen lay awake a long while that night thinking of the particular gentleness of his hands in her wet hair, she told no one, least of all herself, what that meant. Trouble found them again a week later, sharper and closer than before. Roscoe had ridden alone into Alderwood Crossing to post letters and collect supplies, and did not come home by dark, and when he finally rode in near midnight, it was with a split lip and a rising bruise along one cheekbone and a grim, closed look Ellen had not seen on him before. "Talbot's men," he said before she could ask, swinging down from his horse in the yard. "3 of them, waiting for me outside the mercantile. Friendly warning, they called it," said a man who goes around asking questions about the Combine's business, writing letters to Olympia, ought to think hard on whether he's got family here that might come to harm on account of his meddling. Ellen's stomach turned cold. "Family? I've got none, not living, not that they could reach. But they didn't know that when they said it, or maybe they did and meant it a different way." His eyes found hers in the dark, and she understood with a jolt exactly what he meant, and exactly whom Talbot's men had been thinking of when they spoke of family that might come to harm. "They took my saddlebag. Had a copy of the ledger in it, one I'd made in case something happened to the first. It's gone now, along with 2 of Whitfield's letters." "Are you hurt badly?" "Nothing that won't mend." He managed a thin ghost of his usual half-smile. "I've had worse from a bad-tempered bull." She fetched water and cloth without being asked, and tended his split lip at the kitchen table the way she had tended his shoulder weeks before, and this time neither of them pretended the closeness between them was only practical necessity. "You should stop," she said quietly, dabbing at the cut above his eyebrow. "The letters, the ledgers, all of it, it isn't worth your life, Roscoe. Isn't it?" He caught her wrist, gentle but firm, stilling her hand. "Ellen, the Hallorans lost their barn. Old Widow Ruiz has had 2 calves go missing, and found their hides dumped in her well, poisoning her only water. Your own father was shot trying to defend a neighbor from men paid by the family he means for you to marry into. If men like Talbot and Merrick can do all that and walk free because everyone's too frightened or too beholden to say otherwise, then no, I don't believe stopping is worth my life. I believe it's worth considerably less than going on. And if they kill you for it, then I'll have died doing something that mattered, which is more than most men can say." His thumb moved once, softly, along the inside of her wrist, and she felt it everywhere at once. "I'm not asking you to carry any of this risk on my account, Ellen. You've your own life to think of, your own wedding coming." "Don't," she said, sharper than she meant, pulling her hand back though every part of her wanted to leave it exactly where it was. "Don't speak to me of the wedding like it's a settled thing I've chosen with my whole heart, Roscoe Vaughn, because you know better than that." He looked at her for a long moment, something fierce and careful warring in his face. "Do I?" "You do." She turned away, busying herself with the basin of bloodied water rather than meet his eyes. "I agreed to it to save my father's land. That's the whole of my reasoning, and it was never anything more romantic than arithmetic. If there's another way to save this ranch that doesn't require me marrying a man I feel nothing for beyond mild pity, I would take it in an instant, and you know that too, or you wouldn't have looked so wounded just now at the mere mention of the wedding date." The silence that followed was long enough that Ellen thought she had said too much, revealed too much of the raw, unspoken thing between them before either of them was ready to name it. But when Roscoe finally spoke, his voice was low and rough with a feeling he seemed to be fighting to contain. "I've no right to hope for anything from you, Ellen. I'm a hired hand with $40 a month and a horse that isn't even mine outright yet. Your father owns 3,000 acres and a name that's meant something in this valley for 20 years. I've told myself every day for longer than I care to admit that whatever I feel watching you ride out at dawn, or hearing you laugh with your father over supper, or watching you stitch up a fool cowhand's shoulder gentle as if he mattered to you, that it isn't my place to feel any of it, because I've nothing to offer a woman like you beyond honest work and an empty future. Roscoe, let me finish, because I don't know that I'll find the courage twice. He stood, and the kitchen suddenly felt very small and very warm despite the cold night pressing at the windows. I think I have loved you, Ellen Covington, since near the first month I came to work this ranch, and I have said nothing of it in 3 years, because it seemed to me the height of foolishness for a man in my position to want a thing so far above his reach. I'm saying it now because I nearly died today for want of doing something that mattered, and because I find I cannot go on watching you walk toward a wedding with another man while pretending my own heart has no opinion on the matter. You don't owe me anything in return. I only needed you to know it finally, plainly, before either of us runs out of chances to say it. Ellen stood very still, the basin forgotten in her hands, and felt something break open in her chest that she had been holding shut, carefully, dutifully, for months. "You foolish, stubborn man," she said, and her voice was not quite steady. "Do you have any notion how long I've waited for you to say something, anything, instead of standing there being noble and silent and letting me think you felt nothing at all?" His whole face changed, hope breaking across it like sunrise. "Ellen, I don't love Everett Merrick," she said. "I have never loved Everett Merrick. I have spent months telling myself that love is a luxury a rancher's daughter with a mortgaged home cannot afford, and all the while wishing every single day that the man riding beside me checking fence lines was the one I was promised to instead." She set the basin down before her hands could betray her by shaking. "I don't know how we save this ranch without that wedding, Roscoe. I don't know how any of this ends well. But I know I would rather face ruin standing beside you, honestly, than save this land by marrying a man I do not love." He crossed the small distance between them in 2 steps, and this time neither of them hesitated. His hands came up to frame her face, careful despite the urgency in his eyes, and when he kissed her it was soft at first, questioning, and then not soft at all. 3 years of unspoken feeling breaking loose at once. Ellen kissed him back with everything she had been holding in check since the night she'd nearly shot him in the yard, and when they finally broke apart, both a little breathless, he rested his forehead against hers and let out a shaky laugh. "I've wanted to do that since the day you doctored my shoulder," he admitted. "You might have said so sooner and saved us both a great deal of suffering." "I might have. I was a coward about it." He pulled back enough to look at her properly, his thumb tracing her cheekbone. "But I'm not a coward now, Ellen. Whatever comes of exposing Merrick and Talbot both, whatever it costs me, I mean to see it through, and I mean to do it standing beside you if you'll have me." "I'll have you," she said, "though I expect we'd better solve the small matter of an outlaw gang and a corrupted marshal before either of us starts planning any wedding of our own." They did not have long to plan anything at all, because 8 days later Silas Merrick announced that the harvest market day, timed to coincide with the county's celebration of Washington's admission to the Union, would also serve as his son's wedding to Ellen Covington, the ceremony to be held in the town square itself, before the largest gathering Alderwood Crossing had seen in years, buyers and dignitaries from Seattle and Tacoma among the guests. It was, Ellen understood immediately, both a trap and an opportunity, Merrick's way of forcing her hand publicly before she could find a graceful way to withdraw. And if they were careful and fortunate in equal measure, the very stage on which Roscoe's evidence might finally be laid bare before witnesses too numerous and too respectable for Marshal Higgins to silence. "He means to make it impossible for you to refuse without a public scandal," Roscoe said grimly, the morning the news reached the ranch by way of a stiffly worded invitation card delivered by one of Merrick's own hands. "A wedding in front of the whole county, with the state's admission being celebrated at the same hour. You cry off after that's announced, and he'll paint you as an ungrateful, faithless girl who humiliated a good family in front of half the territory. Let him try, Ellen said, though her heart was pounding. I'd rather be called faithless than be married to a man whose father burns down his neighbor's barns. There's something else, Roscoe said slowly, turning the invitation over in his hands. State Inspector Whitfield's office is in Olympia. If Merrick's holding a grand market day to mark statehood, drawing buyers from every corner of the region, it's exactly the sort of gathering that draws attention from Olympia too. Officials wanting to be seen celebrating the new state's commerce. If Whitfield himself or someone from his office could be persuaded to attend, then whatever happens, it happens in front of a witness with the authority to act on it, Ellen finished, instead of a marshal who's already been bought. They wrote to Whitfield that same afternoon, laying out the date and the stakes as plainly as they dared on paper, and prayed the letter would reach Olympia and bring a response back in time, a journey that would take the better part of a week each way, even under good conditions, leaving precious little margin before the market day arrived. In the meantime, there was still a wedding to prevent, and a father to bring fully into their confidence, and Ellen found, in the days that followed, that Thomas Covington's anger, once roused on his daughter's behalf and his own wounded pride together, burned hotter and steadier than she had expected from a man she had thought half broken by grief and debt. I'll not have my daughter sold like a heifer at auction to settle a debt that man engineered against me in the first place, he said, pacing the parlor with more energy than Ellen had seen in him since her mother's death. Let him try to collect on that note once the truth's out. Let him try. He'll try to collect before the truth is out if he can manage it, Roscoe warned. Merrick's no fool. If he senses the ground shifting under him, he may call the note due early, force foreclosure before market day ever arrives, just to remove any leverage we might have. Then we'd best make certain the ground doesn't shift where he can see it, Thomas said, until it's too late for him to do anything about it at all. The days between then and the market day passed in a strange, taut suspension, warm autumn afternoons giving way to nights so cold that frost silvered the pasture grass by morning, the whole valley holding its breath the way the season itself seemed to, caught between two versions of the world. Ellen and Roscoe continued their quiet work, gathering sworn statements from every small rancher along Cedar Pass Road willing to put their name to a complaint, careful never to be seen together in town where word might reach Merrick's ears too soon, though in the privacy of the ranch there was no more pretending. Thomas Covington, for his part, watched the two of them with an expression that shifted, over the course of those weeks, from surprise to resignation to something that looked very much like relief, as though a weight he had not known he was carrying had finally been set down. "You'll marry him, once this is settled," he said to Ellen one evening, not quite a question. "If he'll still have me, once everyone in the county knows I jilted Everett Merrick in front of half the territory." "Any man worth having will have you the same after as before," Thomas said, "and Vaughn is worth having, girl. I should have seen it plain 3 years ago instead of letting his lack of standing blind me to his character. Your mother would have seen it in a week. She never did care for a man's bank account when weighing his worth." No word came from Olympia as the days dwindled, and Ellen tried not to let despair creep in as the market day drew near with no confirmation that Whitfield or anyone from his office would attend. Everett rode out twice more in those final weeks, increasingly anxious himself, and on the second visit, alone with Ellen in the yard while Thomas kept to the house, he said something that stayed with her afterward. "I know you don't love me," he said quietly, not meeting her eyes. "I've known it a long while, I think, longer than I've let myself admit. My father says love isn't the point of a marriage like ours, that respect and prosperity will grow into something else given time. But I watched you with Vaughn at your father's supper table last month, before either of you knew I was watching, and I understood then that whatever might grow between you and me, It would never be that. "Everett, I'm not angry," he said, and he sounded, if anything, faintly relieved to say it aloud at last. "I never wanted this arrangement any more than you did, Ellen, truth told. I've simply never had the courage to tell my father no about anything in my whole life." He hesitated, then added low, "I found papers in his study last week. Correspondence with Jed Talbot, arrangements for payment, dates that match up with things that have happened to your neighbors' places. I don't know what to do with what I found. I'm frightened of him, if I'm honest with you, and ashamed of that fear." Ellen's heart began to pound. "Everett, if you could get us those papers, or even copies of them, it might be the very proof we need to stop this wedding, and stop your father before anyone else is hurt." He looked at her a long moment, something resolving behind his uncertain eyes. "I'll think on it," he said. "I'm not brave the way Vaughn is, Ellen, but I'm not entirely without a conscience either, whatever my father believes." He rode away without promising more than that, and Ellen did not know in the days that followed whether to hope for his help or fear his hesitation would win out. But 3 days before the market day, a folded paper arrived at the ranch tucked inside an ordinary feed sack delivered by an anonymous hand, and when Ellen opened it she found, in Silas Merrick's own unmistakable script, a letter to Jed Talbot dated the previous spring, authorizing payment for services rendered regarding certain properties along Cedar Pass Road and naming, among others, both the Halloran farm and the Ruiz claim explicitly. "He's given us his own hand against him," Roscoe said, reading it over twice to be certain, wonder and grim satisfaction mingling on his face. "Whatever it cost Everett Merrick to send this, it may be the thing that saves us all." The market day dawned bright and startlingly warm for so late in the season, the kind of deceptive autumn morning that made a person forget how quickly the cold could return once the sun dropped behind the western ridges. And by mid-morning, the streets of Alderwood Crossing were thick with wagons and horses, and the lowing of penned cattle awaiting the auction block, bunting strung between the false-fronted buildings in red, white, and blue to mark the occasion of Washington's new statehood. A brass band from Mount Vernon tuning up near the town square, where a raised platform had been built for both the auctioneer and, later, for the wedding that was meant to follow the day's commerce. Ellen rode into town with her father and Roscoe both, dressed not in a wedding gown but in her plainest riding clothes, the folded letter and Roscoe's ledgers secured in a leather satchel she carried herself, and refused to let out of her sight. They had sent word ahead to every small rancher who had given testimony, asking them to be present in the square by midday, and had received, 2 days prior, a brief telegram relayed up from Mount Vernon confirming that a representative of the state cattle inspector's office would indeed attend the day's festivities, though it gave no name and no promise of what action, if any, might follow. The auction proceeded through the morning much as such things always did, pens of cattle driven up to the block, Merrick's own auctioneer calling bids in his practiced sing-song, buyers from Seattle and Tacoma inspecting stock and haggling over prices. All of it ordinary and unremarkable except for the current of tension running beneath it, visible in the careful way Ellen's neighbors avoided looking directly at Silas Merrick, where he stood near the platform in his good black coat, beaming at the crowd like a man well satisfied with his position in the world. It was near noon, with the crowd at its thickest and the statehood proclamation about to be read aloud from the platform by the visiting dignitary from Olympia, that Jed Talbot made his move, and it was, as Roscoe had predicted it might be, bold enough to leave no room for anyone to look away. Talbot and 4 of his riders came into the square at a hard canter, scattering pedestrians, and reined up hard before the auction pens where the day's proceeds, several $1,000s collected from the morning's sales and meant to be distributed to the ranchers who had sold their stock, sat locked in a strongbox under the nominal guard of Marshal Higgins himself. "Nobody need be hurt," Talbot called out, loud enough to carry across the square, his rifle resting easy across his saddle in a way that promised violence all the same. "This is combined business. Marshal, if you'd be so kind as to hand over that box." Higgins, to no one's surprise, complied without protest, and it was in that moment, with the crowd frozen in shock and the brass band trailing off into ragged silence, that Roscoe Vaughn stepped up onto the auction platform itself, his ledger held high overhead. "Every soul in this square ought to see what's happening plain," he shouted, his voice carrying with a clarity that startled even Ellen, who had never heard him raise it so. "That strongbox holds money owed to the small ranchers of this valley for cattle they sold fair and honest this morning. Jed Talbot's been paid to steal it, same as he's been paid to burn barns and poison wells and run off any rancher who won't sell through Silas Merrick's combine at whatever price Merrick's crooked scales decide to name." The crowd's shock cracked into an uproar, voices rising, and Silas Merrick's composed face went suddenly, dangerously still. "That man's a disgruntled hired hand spreading lies to cover his own thieving," Merrick called out, moving toward the platform himself, but his voice had lost some of its easy authority. "I've got a year of honest weights recorded here against your scales figures, Merrick, and sworn statements from a dozen ranchers in this valley willing to say the same." Roscoe's eyes found Ellen's in the crowd, and she nodded once and stepped forward herself, satchel in hand, drawing the folded letter free. "And I have this," she called out, loud enough for the platform and the crowd both to hear, "a letter in Silas Merrick's own handwriting authorizing payment to Jed Talbot for burning the Halloran family's barn and poisoning Widow Ruiz's well, dated last spring, months before either crime occurred." What happened next happened very fast. One of Talbot's riders, seeing the tide of the crowd's mood turning ugly and dangerous toward them, made to spur his horse toward the platform, rifle coming up, and Ellen, without quite deciding to do it, threw herself sideways into Roscoe, knocking him off the platform's edge and out of the line of fire just as the rifle discharged, the shot going wide into the bunting overhead. The crowd scattered screaming, and in the chaos that followed, Thomas Covington, standing near the pens with a rifle of his own, fired a warning shot into the air that brought Talbot's spooked horse rearing, unseating its rider entirely. It was Ellen who moved next, snatching up the fallen rider's dropped rifle before he could recover it, leveling it at Talbot himself with hands that, this time, truly did not shake at all. "Nobody else needs to be hurt today," she said, echoing Talbot's own words back at him with a coldness that surprised even her. "Not if you get off that horse now and let go of that strongbox." Whether it was the rifle in her hands, or the sight of half the county's ranchers converging on the square with their own weapons drawn, or simply the arrival, at that precise chaotic moment, of a stranger in a gray traveling coat, who pushed through the crowd calling out in a voice of unmistakable authority that he was Deputy State Inspector Cole Ambrose, and that everyone present had best hold their positions for the law, Talbot chose discretion. Wheeling his horse and spurring for the edge of town with his remaining men close behind, abandoning the strongbox where it had fallen in the dust. Marshal Higgins, caught flat-footed between the fleeing outlaws and a crowd that had just watched him hand over the county's money without protest, made a half-hearted move to follow, but Cole Ambrose's hand on his shoulder stopped him cold. "I think you'd best stay right here, Marshal," Ambrose said, not unkindly but with absolute finality, "and answer some questions of your own, given what I've just witnessed and what I've been reading in correspondence forwarded to my office these past weeks." In the confusion that followed, Silas Merrick attempted a dignified retreat of his own, but found his path blocked by his own son, who stood pale but resolute before his father in the center of the square, the crowd's attention swinging toward this new and unexpected drama. "I gave Ellen that letter, Father," Everett said, his voice shaking but clear enough to carry. "I found it in your study. I've known for weeks what you did to the Hallorans, to Widow Ruiz, to half the valley, and I let myself believe I could look away from it because it was easier than standing against you. I can't do that anymore. He turned to Ellen. I release you from any promise you made to me. I never should have asked it of you in the first place, knowing what I knew, and I'm sorry truly for the part I played in it. It was, Ellen thought, the bravest thing she had ever seen Everett Merrick do, and she found she could not hate him for the rest of it, only pity him and be grateful for this last, unexpected act of decency. Thank you, Everett, she said quietly. I hope you find the courage to build something of your own, away from all this. Silas Merrick, surrounded now by his own neighbors, his own son turned against him, and a state official with legal authority to act, seemed for the first time in the entire proceeding to understand fully how thoroughly the ground had shifted beneath him. This is absurd, he blustered. A forged letter, a disgruntled employee's fabricated ledgers, you cannot possibly. I can and will take all of it into evidence, Ambrose said, along with sworn statements from every rancher in this square, and I'll be very interested indeed to compare your handwriting on that letter against the correspondence you've filed with the county recorder's office over the years, Mr. Merrick, which I have every confidence will match rather too well for your comfort. By the time the sun began sliding down toward the western ridges, painting the square in long gold light, Silas Merrick had been taken into custody pending formal charges. Marshal Higgins had been relieved of his post by Deputy Inspector Ambrose acting under state authority, and word had already reached town that Jed Talbot and his remaining riders had been spotted fleeing east toward the mountains, with a posse of angry, newly emboldened ranchers, Thomas Covington chief among them, already forming to see them run to ground before winter closed the passes. Roscoe found Ellen sitting on the edge of the empty auction platform as the crowd slowly dispersed, the brass band, in a fit of determined optimism, finally striking up a ragged rendition of a patriotic tune to mark the statehood proclamation that had been all but forgotten in the day's excitement. He had a fresh scrape along his jaw from the fall off the platform, and Ellen's sleeve was torn where she had thrown herself against him, and neither of them in that moment could quite believe the danger had actually passed. You saved my life today, he said, settling beside her, throwing yourself at me like that. You'd have done the same for me, and have, in fact, on more than one occasion. I have. He took her hand, turning it over gently in his own, tracing the calluses there that spoke of a lifetime of ranch work rather than the soft hands of a pampered rancher's daughter. Ellen, I meant every word I said to you that night in the kitchen, but I find I want to say it again, properly, now that there's no gang and no marshal and no false wedding standing between us. Then say it, she said, smiling despite the exhaustion pulling at every part of her. I love you, he said simply, and I would be honored whenever you're ready and not one moment sooner to marry you properly, as a man who has nothing to offer but his honest work and his whole heart. That's more than enough, Ellen said, echoing words he'd once said to her, and kissed him there on the platform in full view of half the town, not caring one bit who saw. The weeks that followed brought their own share of business to attend to, though none of it carried the sharp danger of the market day itself. Jed Talbot was run to ground 8 days later in a line shack up near the pass, his remaining men having scattered rather than face the combined posse of ranchers, and eventually, a proper contingent of territorial marshals sent up from Seattle once word of the whole affair reached the capital. Talbot himself offered little resistance once cornered, and testified readily enough, once faced with the prospect of hanging alone for crimes he insisted had been ordered and paid for by Silas Merrick, that the combine owner had indeed directed every fire and threat along Cedar Pass Road for the better part of 2 years, seeking to consolidate control of the valley's cattle trade by driving small ranchers into debt, and then buying up their land at a fraction of its worth. Silas Merrick's trial, held in Mount Vernon the following spring, drew reporters from as far as Seattle and Olympia, the whole sordid business of the combine's fraud laid bare in testimony that included Roscoe's meticulous ledgers, the recovered correspondence, and sworn statements from nearly every small rancher in the valley. He was convicted on charges of fraud and conspiracy, and sentenced to a term in the territorial, now state, penitentiary, while the Mount Vernon Bank, faced with the public exposure of Merrick's manipulations, quietly voided the fraudulent portion of the debt hanging over the Covington ranch and several of its neighbors besides. The note reduced to a sum Thomas Covington could reasonably expect to pay down over the coming years with honest cattle sales at honest prices. Everett Merrick, for his part, sold what remained of his father's interests once the estate was settled and left the valley entirely, writing once to Ellen from Portland to say he had taken a position clerking for a shipping concern there, and found, to his own considerable surprise, that he rather liked standing on his own 2 feet for the first time in his life. Ellen read the letter with genuine gladness for him, and wrote back wishing him well, and felt, in doing so, the last small knot of guilt over the whole affair finally loosen and let go. State Cattle Inspector Whitfield's office, with Deputy Ambrose's strong recommendation, established a proper weighing station under independent oversight in Alderwood Crossing that winter, ending forever the combine's ability to cheat ranchers on their sales, and the small outfits along Cedar Pass Road, freed at last from Talbot's extortion and Merrick's manipulation, banded together into a cooperative of their own devising, pooling their cattle drives for better prices and safer travel, with Roscoe Vaughn, whose honesty and careful record-keeping had done so much to bring the whole scheme to light, elected by common consent to serve as the cooperative's official buyer and bookkeeper, a position that came with a salary considerably better than any he had earned as a hired ranch hand, and more importantly to him, the standing to finally, properly, ask Thomas Covington for his daughter's hand without a shred of the doubt that had silenced him for 3 long years. "You already have my blessing," Thomas told him, laughing, the first real full laugh Ellen had heard from her father in longer than she could remember. "Have had it since that night you laid out your ledger on my kitchen table and let an old fool see how badly he'd misjudged you. Ask the girl herself, Vaughn. She's the one whose answer matters." Ellen's answer, when Roscoe finally did ask her properly, down on one knee in the pasture where they had first ridden out together to gather evidence against a corrupt and greedy man, was an immediate and tearful yes, given beneath a sky gone the deep gold of a Washington autumn evening, the first frost of the season silvering the grass at their feet while the day's last warmth still lingered in the air, that same uncertain, beautiful turning of the seasons that had marked every stage of their courtship from the night she had nearly shot him to the moment she promised him her whole life instead. They were married in December, in the small church at Alderwood Crossing, with snow falling soft and steady outside the windows, and every rancher along Cedar Pass Road crowded inside to witness it. Lars and Astrid Halloran among them with their barn already half rebuilt through the cooperative's shared labor. Widow Ruiz beaming from the front pew, Thomas Covington standing straight and proud to give his daughter away. No longer the broken, defeated man he had been a year before, but something restored. Something healed alongside the land itself. Ellen wore her mother's wedding dress, carefully altered, and carried a small bouquet of winter greenery gathered from the ranch that morning. And when Roscoe took her hands before the minister and promised to love and honor her all his days, his voice did not shake at all, steady the way it had always been steady, through gunfire and floodwater and every danger they had faced together and would face, she knew, together still, for whatever years lay ahead. "I told you once I'd no right to hope for anything from you," he murmured to her after the ceremony, as they stood together on the church steps watching snow settle over the rooftops of the little town that had so nearly destroyed them both. "I'm glad I was wrong about that, Ellen." "You were wrong about a great many things, Roscoe Vaughn," she said, laughing, leaning into the warmth of him against the cold. "Thank goodness you finally found the courage to be wrong out loud." They rode home together that evening to the ranch that was, now and forever, secured and safe, the debt honestly settled, the danger truly past, The land her mother and father had carved from wilderness 2 decades before standing solid and sure beneath a blanket of new snow, waiting for whatever the coming spring, and all the seasons after it, might bring to the two of them together at last, exactly where they belonged,